Okay, tonight we're going to look at Book 1, chapters 4 and 5. And notice the main point. It's right underneath the caption, "This knowledge is either smothered or corrupted, partly by ignorance, partly by malice." What do we mean by this knowledge? We've been talking about the natural knowledge of God, the seed of religion. So here's the main point. The seed of religion, that there is some sort of divinity. Today we might say some sort of higher power. The seed of religion, that there is some sort of divinity. That's what we mean by the seed of religion. This seed of religion cannot be uprooted, as hard as men might try. But this seed is so corrupted that by itself it produces only the worst fruits. So man left by himself, unredeemed man left to himself, will corrupt this natural knowledge of God. Okay, let's consider together Book 1, chapters 4 and 5. We begin with that first paragraph, 1.4.1. That's Book 1, chapter 4, section 1. As experience shows, God has sown a seed of religion in all men. So you might recall last time, Calvin gave examples from experience that men prove by the way they live, by the things that they do, by all of the different religions. Men prove that they do have this seed of religion. So as experience shows, God has sown a seed of religion in all men. And he can multiply examples. Yet, all degenerate from the true knowledge of him. And so it happens that no real piety remains in the world. If you look at those two asterisks, drop down to the middle paragraph where you find those two asterisks. I saved this portion of the Institutes to put right here at this point, that we might be reminded of what Calvin is doing. So he's already defined piety. Earlier in 1.2.1, he defined piety as reverence joined with love of God. And he explained this in the next section, 1.2.2, that the pious mind does not dream up for itself any God it pleases, but contemplates the one and only true God. And it does not attach to him whatever it pleases, but is content to hold him to be as he manifests himself. That's what piety is. And Calvin says no real piety remains in the world. That's the kind of piety that Adam had, and all men would have had if Adam remained upright, but that's a big if. Furthermore, because the pious mind understands and acknowledges God for who he is, it trusts in him. It betakes itself to his protection, waiting for help from him. It doubts not that in his loving kindness a remedy will be provided for all its ills. It deems it meet and right to observe his authority in all things, reverence his majesty, take care to advance his glory, and obey his commands. Because it sees him to be a righteous judge, armed with severity to punish wickedness, it ever holds his judgment seat before its gaze, and through fear of him restrains itself from provoking his anger. And yet, it is not so terrified as to wish to withdraw, even if some way of escape were open. Besides, this mind, that is, this pious mind, restrains itself from sinning, not out of dread of punishment alone, but because it loves and reveres God as Father. It worships and adores him as Lord. Even if there were no hell, it would still shudder at offending him alone. That's the pious mind. We obey God out of love and reverence, even if there were no hell. The pious mind is restored only in redemption. And that's Calvin's point. A pious mind is found only in those who are redeemed by the grace of Christ. Okay, back up to the paragraph where there were 2 asterisks. Some people slip into superstition. I looked up superstition. I really like to look up words now to see what the dictionary says. Any belief that is unjustified or irrational. That's a superstitious belief. So notice what Calvin is doing here. He's going to give us many examples of how people corrupt this seat of religion, this natural awareness that there is a God. Some people slip into superstition. This involves pride and obstinacy. What's obstinacy? Stubbornness. For in seeking God, men do not rise above themselves as they should, but measure him by the yardstick of their own carnal stupidity. That's pride. Remember the philosophers' philosophy? Man is the measure of all things. Well, if I were God, I would. That's pride, to measure God by the yardstick of our own mind, our own carnal stupidity. And they neglect sound investigation. That's obstinacy. You're stubborn. Think about it rationally. Is there any way for me to know what any of you are thinking unless you tell me? There's no way. So sound investigation would lead me to ask you, what are you thinking? There's no way that we can know God unless he reveals himself to us. And we need to receive him as he reveals himself. But some neglect sound investigation. Thus, out of curiosity, they fly off into empty speculations. They do not therefore apprehend, that is, understand God as he offers himself, but imagine him as they have fashioned him in their own presumption. Indeed, they are worshiping not God, but a figment and a dream of their own heart. Paul eloquently notes this wickedness in Romans 1:21 through 22. Some people slip into superstition. That's one way that some people corrupt this natural awareness of God. Other people, and that brings us to the next paragraph, other people just come right out and deny God. That's another way that people corrupt this natural awareness of God. So next paragraph, section 2. Those who go so far as to deny God's existence, and those scripture references are identical, the Bible says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. So there are some people who go so far as to actually deny God's existence. Not every unbeliever denies the existence of God. There are many unbelievers who are not atheists. But those who do deny God's existence are those who, after they have become hardened in insolent, that is, arrogant, and habitual sinning, furiously repel all remembrance of God, although this is freely suggested to them inwardly from the feeling of nature. Remember Calvin's point earlier. No matter how hard fallen man tries, he cannot escape this natural awareness. He furiously, I love that, he furiously repels all remembrance of God. He can't get rid of all of it, but he is furiously trying. All right, even though they are compelled, that means they're forced to recognize some God, whether they admit it or not, they're forced to say, at the very least, you know, there might be a higher power. I can't rule that out completely. Even though they are forced to recognize some God, what do they do with that knowledge? They fashion a dead and empty idol. They imagine him idle in heaven with no care for the world. How many of you have ever studied deism? Deists believe that God is basically idle in heaven. He created the world, and then he stepped back like a watchmaker makes a watch and steps back and watches the watch run by itself. So they imagine him idle in heaven with no care for the world because they persuade themselves that God does not see. Notice they have to persuade themselves. I've often said it's hard work being an atheist. Because they persuade themselves that God does not see, they proudly applaud their own wrongdoing. Let's look at Psalm 10, verse 11. Psalm 10, verse 11. He has said in his heart, God has forgotten, he hides his face, he will never see. Again, I like your point. He says that in his heart because he's trying to persuade himself, trying to convince himself that this is so. He would love it to be so. He wants it to be so. By thus extinguishing their fear of heavenly judgment, and that reference in Psalm 36 verse 1 says there's no fear. The ungodly have no fear of God. By thus extinguishing their fear of heavenly judgment, they are extinguishing the light of nature. You'll find that phrase in the Canons of Dort and elsewhere in Reformed confessions. What do we mean by the light of nature? That's the seed of religion. That's the light that the natural man still has. But they are deliberately blinding themselves. Notice they're deliberately blinding themselves. That makes me think of another verse in 2 Peter chapter 3 where Peter says they are willingly ignorant. They want to be ignorant. They don't want to hear it. But they are deliberately blinding themselves because they know better. Here's what they know. There is nothing less in accord with God's nature than for him to cast off the government of the universe and abandon it to fortune, and to be blind to the wicked deeds of men so that they may lust unpunished. And in Romans 1:32, which we looked at last week, it says that the wicked know that what they're doing is wrong, it deserves God's judgment, but they're going to do it anyway. And it is God's just punishment of the wicked that after they have closed their eyes in seeing, they see not. But their stupidity never increases to the point where God does not at times bring them back to his judgment seat. So look at that statement again at the bottom of page 1. There is nothing less in accord with God's nature. Okay, you just can't say, well, there's got to be some sort of God, and then define him however you want. Hopefully he's idle in heaven. Hopefully he doesn't see anything. Hopefully he'll wink when I do wrong. That's foolish. That's irrational. If God exists, then guess what? He's not going to leave sin unpunished. So that's the fight that's going on. That's the battle that's going on in the heart of the unbeliever. He is trying to extinguish this light, trying to extinguish this fear of facing God. But he can't completely. Okay. Let's move on to page 2, 1.4.3. We are not to fashion God according to our own whim. Thus is overthrown that vain defense of those who superstitiously, now we're back to the people who slip into superstition, people superstitiously think that any zeal for religion, however preposterous, is sufficient. But they do not realize that true religion ought to be conformed to God's will as to a universal rule, that God ever remains like himself and is not a specter or phantasm to be transformed according to anyone's whim. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm not here to bash them tonight, but the first step is you have to turn your life over to a higher power, however you perceive him, her, or it. God can be whatever you want him or her or it to be. And I've often thought about asking somebody who thinks that way, do you want other people to do that to you? Do you want me to just to think of you however I want to? Or are you jealous for your reputation? Well, what about God? Don't you think God is jealous for his reputation, that he is viewed properly and accurately for who he is? Moreover, those who are superstitious reject what God prescribes as pleasing to himself, and they set up their own false rites to God, false ceremonies. Such people, whether they conceive of one God or several, depart from the true God and forsake him, and having left him, they have nothing left except an accursed idol. Think of all the many different religions. Think of all the people who think that because they believe in God, they're okay. And what did James say about such people who think a belief in God is all you need? The devils believe and tremble. Okay, let's talk about hypocrisy in the next section, 1.4.4. A second sin arises. What's the first sin? People fashion God according to their own whim. A second sin arises that they never consider God at all unless compelled to, unless forced to. And they do not come nigh until they are dragged there, despite their resistance. I always think about going to a funeral. When people go to a funeral, they are forced to consider God. And some people don't go for that reason. Good point. Some people have to be dragged to a funeral. And not even then are they impressed with the voluntary fear that arises out of reverence for the divine majesty. In other words, a proper fear of God is a fear of displeasing him. It's not a fear of going to hell. It's a fear of grieving the one that I love and the one who loves me. And not even then are they impressed with the voluntary fear that arises out of reverence for the divine majesty, but merely with a slavish, forced fear, which God's judgment extorts from them. They really can't get away from that sense that they'll be judged. But while they know that his inescapable power and judgment seat hangs over them, because they can neither do away with it nor flee from it, they recoil from it in dread. And so, lest they should everywhere seem to despise whose majesty weighs upon them, despise him whose majesty weighs upon them, they perform some semblance of religion. Meanwhile, they do not desist from polluting themselves with every sort of vice. It's like people who go to church to feel better. This, however, is but a vain and false shadow of religion, scarcely even worth being called a shadow. And yet, hypocrites would tread these twisting paths so as to seem to approach the God from whom they flee. No man seeks after God, Romans 3, verse 12. They might give the appearance that they are, but they're really trying to flee from God. Just like Adam and Eve trying to hide among the trees. Where they ought to serve him in sanctity of life and integrity of heart, they trump up frivolous trifles and worthless little observances with which to win his favor. Nay, more, with greater license they sluggishly lie in their own filth, because they are confident that they can perform their duty toward him by ridiculous acts of expiation. They think they can bribe God. No matter how wicked I live during the week, come Sunday I can somehow go to church or put money in the offering plate, and that'll take care of it. Then, while their trust ought to have been placed in him, they neglect him and rely upon themselves, his creatures though they be. Finally, they entangle themselves in such a huge mass of errors that blind wickedness stifles and finally extinguishes those sparks which once flashed forth to show them God's glory. Later on, Calvin will use the analogy of somebody walking along the road at night and there's a flash of lightning. You ever experienced that? It just lights up everything for a second, but then it's gone. That's like the seed of religion in the heart of the natural man. There are flashes of God's glory. There's got to be a God. He's just got to be there. But then they extinguish those sparks. Yet that seed remains, which can in no wise be uprooted, that there is some sort of divinity, but this seed is so corrupted that by itself it produces only the worst fruits. That is the main point. That's what I stated at the very beginning. From this it is clear that the reprobate have not been utterly ignorant of God. In tranquil times they wittingly joke about God, but if any occasion for despair presses upon them, it goads them to seek him and impels their perfunctory, that is hasty, half-hearted, superficial prayers. I can't help but think of Pharaoh when the plagues were upon him. He told Moses, pray to your God. Please, ask him to take away the frogs, and then I'll let the people go. And what happened? Moses prays to God, the frogs go away, and then Pharaoh hardens his heart and doesn't let the people go. And someone mentioned this last week, I think. There are no atheists in foxholes. Okay, Book 1, Chapter 5. The knowledge of God shines forth in the fashioning of the universe and the continuing government of it. So you see what Calvin's doing now? He first of all shows how the knowledge of God's existence is implanted in the human heart, and we can't get away from it. Now he's going to talk about what we now call general revelation. He's going to talk about God's revelation of himself in his creation, his handiwork. And look at the caption above 1.5.1. God manifested in his created works. That's sections 1 through 10. And then the caption above this section, the clarity of God's self-disclosure or self-revelation strips us of every excuse. Top of page 3. God not only sowed in men's minds that seed of religion, that's kind of a summary statement of what he talked about in chapter 4. God not only sowed in men's minds that seed of religion, but revealed himself and daily discloses himself in the whole workmanship of the universe. And this is precisely what Paul said in Romans chapter 1, from the creation of the world. This wasn't a case where God revealed himself way back then and no longer reveals himself. From creation, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen. So he revealed himself, past tense, and daily discloses himself in the whole workmanship of the universe. As a consequence, men cannot open their eyes without being compelled. He uses that word a lot, doesn't he? Without being forced to see him, his wisdom and power, for example. Indeed, his divine essence is incomprehensible. It far escapes all human perception. But upon his individual works, he has engraven unmistakable marks of his glory, so clear and so prominent that even unlettered and stupid folk cannot plead the excuse of ignorance. That's the Bible. The heavens declare the glory of God. Not just the heavens, everything. Everything within man, everything about man, and everything around man. Everything outside of man screams God's glory, God's wisdom, God's power. Though the glory of his power and wisdom shine more brightly in heaven, heaven is often called his palace, yet wherever you cast your eyes, there is no spot in the universe wherein you cannot discern at least some sparks of his glory. Okay. 1.5.2, the divine wisdom displayed for all to see. Indeed, men who study the liberal arts penetrate far more deeply into the secrets of the divine wisdom. Yet, Ignorance of them, that is, ignorance of the liberal arts, prevents no one from seeing more than enough of God's workmanship in his creation to lead him to break forth in admiration of the artificer. Likewise, in regard to the structure of the human body, one must have the greatest keenness in order to weigh its articulation, symmetry, beauty, and use. But yet, as all acknowledge, the human body shows itself to be a composition so ingenious that its artificer is rightly judged a wonder worker. What would Calvin say about the human body today if he said that back then when there was very little knowledge of the body in comparison to today? 1.5.3, man is the loftiest proof of divine wisdom. Even certain philosophers long ago called man a microcosm because he is a rare example of God's power, goodness, and wisdom. In Acts 17:27, Paul, and again he's speaking to the heathen philosophers, Paul states that God ought not to be sought afar off, for each one undoubtedly feels within the heavenly grace that quickens him. Indeed, David not only declares that a clear mirror of God's works is in humankind, Psalm 8, verse 4, but that infants, while they nurse at their mother's breasts, have tongues so eloquent to preach his glory that there is no need at all of other orators. Paul quotes from the secular poet Aratus that we are God's offspring, Acts 17:28, because by adorning us with such great excellence, he testifies that he is our Father. 1.5.4, but man turns ungratefully against God. Here, however, the foul ungratefulness of men is disclosed. They have within themselves a workshop graced with God's unnumbered works, and at the same time a storehouse overflowing with inestimable riches. They ought then to break forth into praises of him, but are actually puffed up and swollen with all the more pride. They feel in many wonderful ways that God works in them. They're also taught by the very use of these things what a great variety of gifts they possess from his liberality. They are compelled, forced to know, whether they will or not, that these are the signs of divinity, yet they conceal them within. They don't give God glory for those gifts. How detestable, I ask you, is this madness that man, finding God in his body and soul 100 times, on this very pretense of excellence, denies that there is a God. They will not say it is by chance that they are distinct from brute creatures, yet they set God aside and substitute nature for God. Even evolutionists. I don't believe evolutionists would say that it's by chance that man is distinct from brute creatures. They tried to explain it in some other way than by chance, right? Whether it's natural selection or however else. But bottom line, they're still doing what the ancient philosophers did. They substitute nature for God. They act as though nature itself is God, that nature itself can sustain itself, create itself, whatever. Okay, 1.5.5. You might have noticed that Calvin is just multiplying examples of the same point. So we don't have to read all of this. You can read it on your own. Let's move on. 1.5.6. The Creator reveals his lordship over the creation. Let us therefore remember, whenever each of us contemplates his own nature, that there is one God who so governs all natures, that he would have us look unto him. For nothing is more preposterous than to enjoy the very remarkable gifts that attest the divine nature within us, yet to overlook the author who gives them to us at our asking. Think of all the clear manifestations of God's power which sustains this infinite mass of heaven and earth by his word, and how this power might lead us to ponder his eternity. For he, from whom all things draw their origin, must be eternal and have a beginning from himself. Calvin said it's good to meditate upon the eternity of God, and I remember telling you that even as an unbeliever, when I was a little boy, I used to think about the fact that, yeah, God has to be eternal, because if he wasn't, what was before him? Furthermore, if we ask what caused God to create all these things and what moves him now to preserve them, we shall find that it is his goodness alone. But this being the sole cause, it ought still to be more than sufficient to draw us to his love, inasmuch as there is no creature upon whom God's mercy has not been poured out. Okay, 1.5.7. At this point, Calvin is introducing a discussion regarding God's providence. He's not going to deal with God's providence until Book 1, chapters 16 through 18. And we'll get to those chapters eventually. But he introduces providence at this point to make the point that God's revelation of himself is not just in creation, in his work of creation, but it's ongoing in his work of providence. And I shared with you that article in the Belgian Confession that said as much. So not only does nature leave man without excuse, so also does everyday life. And Calvin explains what he means by that. He's going to talk about those works of God which are outside the ordinary course of nature. In those works of God which are outside the ordinary course of nature are further clear proofs of God's powers. For in administering human society, he also tempers his providence. That's going to be dealt with in Book 1, chapter 16 through 18. That although kindly and beneficent, although kindly and beneficent toward all in numberless ways, he still, by open and daily indications, declares his clemency to the godly and his severity to the wicked and criminal. Thus he clearly shows himself the protector and vindicator of innocence, while he prospers the life of good men with his blessing, relieves their need, soothes and mitigates their pain, and alleviates their calamities. And in all these things he provides for their salvation. This general rule ought not to be obscured by the fact that he frequently allows the wicked and malefactors to exult unpunished for some time, while he permits the upright to be tossed about by many adversities, and even to be oppressed by the impious. But in these cases, it must be remembered that when he leaves many sins unpunished, there will be another judgment to which have been deferred the sins yet to be punished. So notice how everyday life works. What is a general rule about everyday life? If you do the right thing, you're going to be blessed. You'll be blessed in some way. That doesn't mean you won't have trials. But that is a law that works for everybody. Otherwise, these proverbs could never arise from the lips of unbelievers. What goes around comes around. That's a general rule. What goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. Even unbelievers admit that. You reap what you sow. Whatever you put in the ground is going to come out. So however you treat people, that's going to come back to you in some way. That testifies to the existence of a righteous and just God. Every day he shows his clemency to the godly and his severity to the wicked and criminal. Why is it that crime never pays? Crime never pays. Even if you get away with the crime, you can't get away from the guilt. As my dad used to always say, wherever you go, there you are. Okay. All right. Well, we don't have time to look at the rest of this. Calvin is simply multiplying examples of the same point he's been making all along. Next week, we begin to look at the knowledge of God the Creator as revealed in Scripture. And Calvin will begin to articulate his doctrine of Scripture.